So let's move from what we can learn by recognizing the top performers to the group that is working their way up the charts. And again, thanks to three, again, all the panelists, our admiration to be able to find the time with everything that's going on in your worlds right now. But welcome to Lauren Women's College, Amia from the St. Catherine's site from Niagara Health, and Eddie with his whole fleet of new hospitals all on William Osler, all on their own. They have this great group between Etobicoke, Brampton, Civic, and Peel Memorial. What we wanted to explore here is a little bit of the how, and always coming back to how do you work with the project agreement to make these things work well. So the heating and cooling plants, scheduling and controls, getting buy-in from the hospital departments to perhaps see changes in the way the systems operate in their areas. Amia, could I kind of start with you around this whole idea of scheduling and controls at the St. Catherine's site and how that's worked with the FM organization and the developer, which I think is Plenary. Like, how is that unfolding as you're beginning to see improvements at St. Catherine's now?
Yeah, so before I get into that, I'm just going to say we were one of the first ones off the P3s to come off the assembly line. So our PA definitely is a little different than perhaps some of the other PAs that came down for Humber River or some other of the newer P3 sites. And the reason I mention that is that so much of the improvements are driven through the PA and how you work with your partners in achieving those savings. So having said that, we have been working with the partners, which is JCI. So, I would definitely like to connect with Chris at some point to find out how they got the energy manager and everybody in place for that. And as I said, it's so much is driven by the PA and the relationship there. So we are working with, we actually did start a project which was more of a initially exploratory project on how the pain share, gain share, because a lot of mechanism of paying for these energy projects in our PA is geared through the sharing of pain share, gain share monies, and that kind of is a hindrance. But we are working on a project where we put in on time of day use for the reducing the air handlers and kind of putting in restrictions as to slowing them down or sorry, my phone's going off the hook. I'll have to yeah, sorry. So we we have been working on, sorry, it's still working. So it's one of those things that, when you're sitting in your office, although in my basement's become my office now. Anyways, not to take away from that. What I'm saying is that we've put in some of those projects where we are reducing the chiller speeds to 1/3 when there is no occupancy. And we had to go through that working with JCI to get some of that done. And some of those savings that are perhaps based on those measures that we put into place. We are, however, having challenges based on how our PA is written to figure out between the service provider and us that how to harvest these savings and pay for some of these projects that are in the pipeline. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but
yeah, it does really well.
Would like to see more happening. Sorry,
and that it's not easy. It's not easy, but you're beginning.
It's extremely difficult for us. I don't know how much you wanted to. I want to say there, but it is extremely difficult with regards to our PA to find opportunities to work together on energy saving projects. We have been pushing for now 7 years to, get some more concrete energy saving projects going, but there seems to be challenges, and the biggest challenge is how the PA is structured around compensating the project goal for some of that work.
Lauren, moving to you, we just saw the great results over the past, I guess, 6 or 9 months from Women's College. How is that dynamic working at Women's College between yourselves and Black & Mac as the facility manager, and how well does the performance agreement or the project agreement kind of support that relationship?
So I guess, first of all, for those that aren't familiar with Women's College, we are an ambulatory facility. So most of our clinics operate Monday to Friday, 9 to 5. In saying that, we do have some programs that do run outside of those hours, but for the bulk of it, we're a 9 to 5 operation. So in knowing that, that allowed us to work with Black & Mac on looking at some setbacks, primarily for after hours and weekends. So what we found helpful was we put together an energy working group, which was comprised of members from the P3 arrangement. So from Black & Mac, we had members from finance, again, because some of these have capital costs associated with them. And we found that the working group was really instrumental in moving some of our energy initiatives forward, because as per the P3 contract, it's only mandated that we have a quarterly utilities meeting. And we found that that meeting was already crammed, and that it was really important for us to move forward with some of these energy initiatives that we met more frequently. So a couple of the things that we looked at, first of all, we looked at our 2 biggest streams, which was electricity and steam. They were our biggest drivers, where we saw that we could have potential savings. So one of the things was we engaged our OR group and looked at air exchange setbacks in the operating rooms for after hours and weekends. So we went from 20 air exchanges down to 6 air exchanges. And so part of this discussion was ensuring that we had stakeholder engagement. So it was really important that we got the buy-in from our OR partners. So we sort of, during the time when we were working on that implementation, we ensured that we included members from the OR at our monthly working group meetings, just so that they were comfortable with the changes that we wanted to do. We ensured we brought in, case studies from other hospitals, as well as CSA standards. We did a lot of trials and testing, and then we only actually implemented the change permanently once all parties were comfortable. So again, we had a lot of back and forth, and a lot of this is working with the hospital and working with Black & Mac. Another thing too that we found really effective was we looked at our lighting setbacks. And again, because we're ambulatory, we could go down to emergency lighting for the most part after hours. So again, it was really engaging all of the users in the hospital. We ensured that we sent out communications corporately, advising staff of the changes and why we wanted to make these changes. Again, we would provide, our call center number, if there was staff working in the building after hours and they found it too dark in their area, so that Black & Mac could then go and isolate that particular area on the BAS. And then it was just really advising staff of the changes ahead of just making the changes. And I think one of the really important things too is to ensure that you're doing the appropriate trials and testing, and not to just rush into anything, because again, you want to have the involvement from your stakeholders. And we found that to be really beneficial for us moving forward with our energy projects. And again, these were sort of, they seem small on paper, but, we've obviously experienced real savings by just looking at, some of these sort of shorter term projects where we didn't have to outlay huge project costs. Again, to what Amir was saying, where we struggle is, again, with the PA and some of these, you know, larger projects that we want to implement is, where do the costs come from? So a lot of these have huge capital costs, which the PA doesn't always recognize. So as an example, we have looked at wanting to change out fluorescent lighting for LED lighting. We've seen what the savings can be, but one of the issues is the way the PA is written, it's almost a replacement of like for like product. It's not necessarily an upgrade to LEDs. So now that's going to involve more back and forth meetings with our P3 partners, again, because there's going to be capital costs. So that's sort of one area where we've found can be a little bit of a challenge. But I think sometimes too, it's stepping back from the PA and you know, for us, it's working with our partners. And again, we found that having this energy working group, although it's not mandated by the PA, we get most of our work done through that group. That has like the core people that we need, and then we bring in stakeholders depending on what we're doing. So if we are looking at you know, a project with IT as an example, so we're looking at sort of a print strategy where we will sort of centralize printing, and that would obviously have energy savings for us. So we would ensure that we involve IT at our working group meetings so that we have the right players at the table, and we find that we got a lot of work done that way, rather than just the quarterly utilities meeting.
That is so helpful. This idea of bringing the players together, and again, the engagement of the hospital community, not just between the hospital and the FM, but the hospital and the departments who you depend upon. I'd like to come back to Amir a little bit on his experience dealing with departments when changes are proposed. But Eddie, can we kind of step on that second bullet there? You've perhaps done as much as, like, our sense is that the big savings are as hospitals come to grips with managing these Lamborghini heating cooling plants they've created and kind of keeping them on the track. But at Peel Memorial, you've had a big story around that. Can you give us a sense of what that process was as FMCO got their heads around managing the geothermal as well as the heat recovery chillers and putting all that together?
Well, I think you know, I'm blessed with having multiple facilities with multiple partners, all in different stages. So with Peel, you know, the design of the facility was is kind of the driving factor of the great results. You know, all of these project management companies, facility management companies, when they're getting the facility and getting it up, you know, they're getting it up and running. They have generally with the contract about 2 years to get it up and running. So then the second year is, they have 2 years of kind of implementation time, and then the third year is where the gain share comes in. So I think in the 2019 numbers, you're starting to see them do some tweaking. And like Lauren mentioned, we do have those utility subcommittee meetings every quarter. And we were, you know, we're talking about those. We're talking about like what's the performance of the facility? How can we improve? There are clauses in Schedule 36 that talk about ensuring that the facility is optimized, and you know, how can you demonstrate that to the owner's approval? So we you know, it's a lot of investigating, it's a lot of talking to the FMs and ensuring that they know what's going on and they can do some small tweaks here and there, kind of as we see fit.
And Eddie, if we contrast that with Brampton Civic, which is, I think, was the very first of the P3 hospitals out of the chute, if I'm correct.
Yeah.
How is that? Again, you've got, as you say, did you say you're blessed with having three of
these? I did air quotes. Blessed with all these different
how would you contrast those two, the Brampton Civic experience against the Peel Memorial experience? Where is it easier? Where is it harder?
That's a good question. It's hard. It's hard in both for very different reasons. I find, or what we're finding now, is that after the first year is kind of the time where everything gets real. The initial period when they're learning how to operate systems, it's one thing. But if they enter into the pain share, gain share, and there is a pain share component to their report, I think that's what gets the project co's attention, because now the cost is real. So if they can identify what the problem is, if they're missing out on the natural gas side, pinpoint what that target is, and now they have a dollar amount associated to that component, and that's the driver for them to fix it, right? And so we do see that component on, for Brampton Civic, it's a very different beast. We're 10, 15 years or 10 or 12 years in, and the pain share gain share model was never really implemented. So now we are working together and trying to understand how we move projects forward. So Lauren, actually, you mentioned a great question about, we're trying to do a lighting retrofit, and how do we move forward, because there's such a capital component to it. We actually did a parking lighting conversion, and we actually were in many discussions throughout, and actually the FM provider actually paid for it all on its own, because the maintenance saving going from the HID lights to LED lights in 1 year or 2 years paid for that retrofit. And so energy was actually not a driving force. It was actually the maintenance cost was the driving force, and life cycle and handback. So now instead of you're replacing these lights on an 18-month, window or cycle, now you're replacing these on a 10-year basis or 7 to 10-year basis. So if you can marry those two components, that's where you can start to push forward on some of those items or some of those projects. What we find difficult is then when you're talking about changes to the HVAC system, because more or less they argue that there is really no savings on their end for PM. They still have to do PM, maybe not as frequent, but they're still going to do their quarterly PM on an air handler. It's not going to reduce the wear that much. And so when you don't have tangible savings, that's what causes a little bit of issue between the two.
And a lot of negotiation?
A lot of negotiation. I don't want to talk too much on this one, but the other item in some cases, what we're trying to do now is just putting in a variation request to start to say, give me a price. Like, we've been talking about this, we haven't moved forward. Here's a variation. So a variation inquiry, basically trying to get them involved to price out a certain project. And then within the PA, there's a certain time frame associated to that. But then at least they give you something concrete. They've investigated, they've given you a price to start discussing, and then you can start negotiating from that point further.
Okay.
So there's different tools that you can use.
Yeah, and the relationship is everything, I am assuming.
Yes.
Amandeep, any questions from the floor?
There's just one talking about, I think Lauren probably addressed some of that as well, around ventilation retrofits or ventilation scheduling for the air handling systems when they are not occupied in the unoccupied hours. So I think maybe Amir or Eddie can address that part as well, like how you guys dealing with it. Some of the facilities that, for example, at Pete Memorial, is there any particular?
Well, let me put that to Amir, if I may, and kind of pick up on that issue. Have you seen any pushback from hospital departments who don't want to see change?
So let me just give our experience there. What we did was we decided we would look at all the administrative spaces as a first step, and that's where we are. So finance was one, and records, medical records, and stuff like that, where we said, and administrative buildings, so and administrative departments. So we were fortunate that about 3 different air handlers were supplying these areas. So we actually had to go through a entire process with the stakeholder engagement and then the things and stuff. But then there are, you know, nuances to each department. Some come in after hours, and then there's concerns actually by the staff, which are the main thing where, you know, they say, is it going to be bacteria on my desk because there's no air moving, or, you know, is it going, the air quality is going to be good enough, or that kind of issue, or is it going to be stuffy, and that kind of answers need to get answered. But yeah, eventually you do get there. What we have found is that, you know, it never is 100%. You know, you can't capture everything in the first round. You just have to go and implement it. Once we implemented it, we had to tweak it. And that door we left open always, because we knew that, you know, so one of the examples that we had was that in our dialysis unit, the cleaning happens after 11 o'clock is when they close down. So we just looked at their operating hours and at the slowdown of the air handler after 11 p.m. Well, the cleaning happens after that, and then the floors weren't drying, and they were wet in the morning when, you know, the staff would come in, which was a slip and fall hazard. So we had to change the timings to say 1 o'clock now when the slowdown started, and maybe to ramp up an hour before when the staff comes in. So those are the kind of things that you work through with the internal stakeholders. And of course, you know, with a P3 partner, there's a lot of negotiations and what's going to be. There's one other quick example that I'm going to give. You know, we found out that one of the air handlers, there was one medication room that was being supplied by one of these air handlers. So that medication room was getting too hot overnight. Daytime people were coming in and out, and then when we did the tracing for the ducting, this one air handler was just supplying this one room and nothing else you know, everything. So we had to go back. First, we started with changing the timing so that, you know, running it, but then we put in a project. It did cost us $10,000, but, you know, when I looked at the numbers and the savings, I found out there would be we would get the money back in a couple of years, and the rest would be savings for the rest of our, you know, time. So I paid it out of hospital operations, you know, didn't even wait for the pain share, gain share to kick in or whatever. So that is another strategy. Definitely the PAs allow you to pay for some of this. But I also think that, you know, the project codes need to step up with technology updates using life cycle money. When the life cycle comes up, they need to, rather than taking that savings or perhaps, you know, the risk mitigation, they need to look into technology upgrade to achieve some of the savings for the clients.
Extremely helpful. Again, thanks to the three panelists on this group. And would all the panelists please stand by and